Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, a marquee staff writer here at Ballotpedia. So today, I wanted to talk about donor disclosure and privacy policy, which refers to the rules governing the confidentiality of nonprofit donors' identities and/or their personal information. So only 501c4 political education organizations can engage in political lobbying or issue advocacy. And under federal law, these nonprofits generally have to disclose information to the public about the donors that contribute to them. And some state laws may require additional disclosure. So what we wanted to do in this briefing is cover the rules and regulations surrounding donor disclosure and donor privacy in a little bit more detail. And so we'll be touching on the following topics. We want to give you an update on the current state of legislative activity across the country. Next, we want to discuss the debate around disclosure versus privacy and looking at the various arguments for that. And then finally, we want to take a look ahead to what 2022 may hold for various aspects of donor disclosure and privacy policy. So here with us today to help me do that is Ethan Rice, who is a fellow staff writer on the Marquee team. Thank you very much for joining us, Ethan.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's start things off by talking about what's going on in state legislatures all across the country. So what kind of donor disclosure and privacy legislation is Ballotpedia currently tracking?
Well, so far this year, state legislators have introduced at least 41 bills that touch in some way on donor disclosure and privacy. And as you mentioned, Dave, these bills deal with the disclosure of information about nonprofit donors, and this can include their names and other information like addresses or the amount that they donated. Some of these bills require disclosure, while there are others that are focused on the privacy of donors and they prohibit disclosure.
Right. Okay, so that debate, that talking point right there over disclosure versus privacy is something that we're going to get into in a little bit. But when you talk about these bills, what can you tell us about who is introducing this legislation? And can you tell me how many of these bills have been enacted so far this year?
Sure. So out of the 41 bills that we're currently tracking, 13 have been sponsored by Republicans, 17 by Democrats, and the rest either by bipartisan groups or committees. 7 of the bills on this topic have been enacted this year. All of the bills except one, and that's California's Senate Bill 686, were passed in Republican trifecta states. And that means that Republicans controlled the governorship and had majorities in both chambers of the state legislature. California, however, has a Democratic trifecta. So 4 of these bills, one each in Arkansas, Iowa, South Dakota, and Tennessee, are substantially similar in that they all prohibit the disclosure of certain information, although the details of them kind of vary. They're not all exactly the same.
All right, that's interesting. So it seems like these 4 bills are all focused on donor privacy. What sort of donor information will they keep from being disclosed?
So all 4 of these bills, what they have in common is that they prohibit agencies from requiring a tax-exempt nonprofit to provide a public agency with personal information about donors, their members, supporters, or volunteers. They also all prohibit agencies from requiring individuals to provide personal identifying information about their involvement with the nonprofits. They prohibit agencies from publicly disclosing any personal information about a public agency or that a public agency might possess about its donors or supporters. And it prohibits agencies from requiring a current or prospective contractor to provide a public agency with a list of nonprofits the contractor has supported. They don't, however, bar public agencies from releasing personal information about a nonprofit's donors or supporters if that information is pursuant to an active law enforcement investigation or if there is a lawful warrant, subpoena, or other court order involved.
Okay, so 4 of these bills in the states you mentioned prohibit certain forms of disclosure, but I know you also mentioned at the beginning of this segment, Ethan, that there were 7 enacted bills. So what are the major provisions of the other 3?
Right, so the 5th major enacted bill, which was in South Dakota, prevents executive agencies and officials from requiring nonprofits to make disclosures beyond those already required under state and federal law. So its scope is a bit narrower than the bills we just talked about, but it's still sort of similar. California Senate Bill 686 requires nonprofits that qualify as a committee or a sponsor of a committee under the state's campaign finance laws to file a statement of its members with the Secretary of State. And this statement must include a list of everyone with a 10% or greater interest in the committee or who contributed at least $1,000 to the committee. And last, we have Idaho's H0245, which on the other hand is focused on prohibiting foreign contributions, independent expenditures, and electioneering in the state of Idaho in election campaigns that take place in the state of Idaho.
All right, so thank you for that summary of the 7 bills that have been enacted so far this year. Can you tell us how that legislative activity this year compares to what we have seen in prior years?
Well, it appears that the overall amount of bills that we're tracking has decreased somewhat compared to previous years. So if we look back during the first 6 months of 2019, we tracked 72 bills and 13 of those were enacted. In 2020, we tracked 47, 4 of which were enacted. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we've tracked 41 this year, 7 of which were enacted. So if we look at it by partisan sponsorship, during the first 6 months of 2019, in 2020 and 2021, this year, Democrats have sponsored more donor disclosure bills than Republicans have across the board in those 3 years. But overall, we've seen a decrease somewhat in the amount of legislation we're tracking, especially since 2019, where we had 72 bills.
All right, got it. That's a great wrap up. All right, so now that we've talked about the different pieces of legislation that we are tracking, I wanted to get a little bit into the kind of the argument side of things. Whenever I read an article or see something in the news about either a disclosure law or a court case, there seems to be a set of common arguments that are made on both sides of the debate. So does Ballotpedia have any resources for readers who may want to know more about the specifics of this debate or how it's playing out?
Yeah, actually, we're in the process of publishing a set of articles that summarize the arguments made for and against disclosure laws. These arguments generally focus on 3 main subject areas, and that's how we're approaching this and organizing it. So the first area is the disclosure of donor information to governments. And that is different from the next area, which is the disclosure of information to the public. Now, the last area that we're looking at, the last area of the debate is concerned with whether or not disclosing information causes political polarization. So, you know, an increase in sort of the animosity between both sides of the political spectrum.
Okay, so I imagine, being that we're Ballotpedia, we have a breakdown of these both for and against. Let's take a little bit closer look at each of them and talk about what sort of discussions, what sort of arguments are being made in each category.
Right, so we'll start out with arguments in favor of disclosing nonprofit information to governments. So in this section of the overall debate, we often see the argument that disclosure ensures accountability and prevents fraud in government and in nonprofit organizations, that it limits foreign influence, and that it limits the influence of major donors that might use nonprofits to advance their own private interests. Some supporters of disclosure also say that there isn't a substantial risk of donor information being exposed, as those against it sometimes argue, and that it helps to build trust in nonprofits. It endorses their overall missions, and it doesn't deter people from contributing to them. Now, conversely, those arguing against disclosing donor information to governments claim that it violates free speech rights and rights to free association and privacy. Now, they usually contend that disclosure rules are a solution in search of a problem, and that these resources are better spent on something else because they don't see a clear benefit or purpose to these laws, and that the government has other means to combat fraud and corruption, and that they're not really a necessary component of that fight against fraud and corruption. Some other arguments that oppose disclosure say that unintentional disclosure of information occurs and can lead to harassment, backlash, and retaliation. So, you know, if some information is inadvertently disclosed by a government about somebody who donated to a nonprofit, that this may leave them open to, you know, people on the other side of the political spectrum from whatever they donated to, harassing them or otherwise taking action against them.
Okay, that's a great summary of the arguments surrounding government disclosure or the information that is disclosed to governments. Now I'm a little bit curious as to how those arguments and that kind of framework differs from the arguments surrounding disclosure to the public.
Well, there's actually a lot of similarities between the two, but also some pretty key differences. So like those that are in favor of disclosure, supporters of disclosing information to the public often argue that this increases accountability, deters corruption, and limits the ability of donors to use nonprofits to advance their own interests. Other common arguments that we see are that disclosure and donor visibility benefits nonprofits as an endorsement of their mission, as we discussed with the disclosure of governments, and that it doesn't inhibit charitable giving or constrain the constitutional rights to free speech or association. But you also see the argument that donor disclosure is part of a donor's responsibility to stand behind their positions, and that it provides the public with information about who's attempting to influence the public debate. And so those are all arguments made in favor of public disclosure. Now, the other side of the argument is similar in some ways to the other side of the government disclosure argument, in that those against disclosure say that it violates free speech rights, the rights to free association and privacy, and subjects donors to potential harassment, which will in turn inhibit charitable giving, and it harms the viability of nonprofits to collect donations. There's also the argument made against public disclosure that it harms the public by creating a selective enforcement and suppression of ideas that are deemed controversial or that are politically unpopular, and the groups that the public should be able to know about. So in this part of the argument, that they're basically saying that by refusing to disclose or by disclosing this information, they are keeping the public from knowing about things that they have a right to know about.
Okay, I think that's a great look at the set of arguments regarding government disclosure and disclosure to the public. That's a really fascinating breakdown. You mentioned there was a third kind of category of arguments, and that is those around donor disclosure and how it affects political polarization. So what do people mean when they say that disclosure of this type of information either does or does not cause that type of polarization?
Well, the people arguing that limiting disclosure causes political polarization often say that undisclosed spending by nonprofits has allowed donors to have an outsized influence on American politics, and that this erodes the public trust in government and democratic institutions by making political communications and campaign finance more opaque, less transparent. Furthermore, those saying that limiting disclosure causes polarization often make the argument that when you limit disclosure, it creates incentives for controversial ideas to spread in the public square. So arguments that limiting donor disclosure does not cause political polarization, on the other hand, generally say that limiting disclosure ensures that controversial or politically unpopular ideas and causes can be seen and heard in the public square, and that nonprofit donor confidentiality is not the source of political conflict in the first place. Rather, they say that political and social polarization continue to exist even when political campaign donations are completely transparent. And so limiting disclosure can't be the cause of this in this argument. So, there's really a wide range of debate on this topic and all of its related subtopics. But we felt that sort of categorizing the overarching debate about disclosure versus privacy into these sets of sort of argument categories, into a taxonomy of arguments, really helps illustrate some of the nuances of the debate, and it also helps to show how these individual claims can overlap and interact and influence each other in the main areas of argument.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the various arguments and how they kind of break out on both sides. And I'm sure that if readers are interested, viewers are interested, they can go to our site and explore more and really kind of dive deep into a lot of what's going on in this topic. All right. The third thing that we wanted to do in today's webinar was really look ahead a little bit. And so, Ethan, I wanted to kind of ask you, what do you think we can expect in 2022, next year, in regards to either legislation or court challenges in this area? I mean, are there things that happened this year that may influence what we see in the donor disclosure area next year?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a few things that could have a pretty significant impact on some states' donor disclosure and privacy policy in the upcoming year. So there was a rule by a California Ethics Commission that they adopted, and a federal court upheld a disclosure law in Rhode Island. We also have the Americans for Prosperity case that was decided by the Supreme Court this summer. But let's start with that California rule. So in October of this year, the California Fair Political Practices Commission voted unanimously to adopt new disclosure requirements for charitable contributions that are made on behalf of politicians in a practice that's known as behested payments. So a payment is considered a behested payment if an elected official requests that it be made. So it basically involves an official soliciting payments from one individual or organization to be given to another individual or organization. Now, California law currently requires an elected official to disclose charitable donations of $5,000 or more that they or their representatives requested. And according to the LA Times, the requests are often, quote, attributed to the nonprofit foundations and for-profit investment firms where the accounts were held. So under these new rules, elected officials have to report the name of the person directing a behested payment through a donor advised fund. And if the contribution is made anonymously, the elected official has to report that in disclosure reports to the state. Officials will also be required to report when they are involved in making a decision that could potentially affect a donor. But the thing about this is that this rule does not apply to general state legislation. So that would only apply to things outside of that scope. So with that, I think that there's a real chance that we could see some sort of court activity or possibly even some new legislation in California that is related to donor disclosure in the near future.
All right, that's interesting. So what that means is this was a ruling by this government agency that may in the future be somehow affected by either subsequent legislation or some sort of court case, litigation, whatnot. So that'll definitely be something to keep an eye on. Now, you also mentioned at the beginning of this segment here a case in Rhode Island. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there was a September ruling of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and that ruling upheld a Rhode Island law that was passed in 2012, a donor disclosure law in a case called Gatsby Project versus Maderos. So in 2019, there was two 501c4 groups, the Gatsby Project and the Illinois Opportunity Project, and they sued the Rhode Island Board of Elections, saying that paid political messages were protected speech if they weren't coordinated with a specific candidate's campaign. Now, Rhode Island law requires organizations that spend more than $1,000 per year on independent expenditures or electioneering communications to file a report with the Board of Elections that discloses all the donors who contributed more than $1,000. So these organizations are required to register with the board, and they have to provide the names and addresses of the people or groups responsible for these expenditures and list the names of their 5 largest donors from the previous year. So what happened with this case is that it wound up being dismissed by U.S. District Court Judge Mary McElroy, who was appointed by President Trump in August 2020. But the organizations appealed the case to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and in their ruling, federal judges Bruce Marshall-Celia, David Barron, and a district judge, Pedro Delgado Hernandez, upheld the law. And in their ruling, they said that its disclosure requirements were narrow enough to avoid any free speech violations, and that they had a significantly important government interest to fulfill. So when you have rulings like that, it's possible that cases like this could really influence the rulings on other state disclosure requirements within the next year, which could, in turn, influence future legislation as well as laws that are already on the books.
Got it. Okay, so that was the First Circuit. That'll be a very interesting thing to keep an eye on, and I'm sure, of course, we'll do that at Ballotpedia. And then there's a third thing that you talked about, and I'll kind of get into a little bit, which is a pretty important Supreme Court decision that was handed down over the summer in Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. And then Bonta is the Attorney General for the state of California. So the case involved, if you're not familiar, a California law that requires nonprofits to disclose their donors' identities to the state Attorney General. And this law required nonprofits to file copies of their IRS 990 forms, which are financial reports that are required under federal law. Now, Schedule B of the 990 collects the names and addresses of donors that contribute in excess of $5,000 in a given tax year. So although the California law did not provide for the public to access this Schedule B address information, name and address information, the court documents showed that there were some inadvertent disclosures that did occur. So given that backdrop, Ethan, what was the next step here at when the case was heard by the Supreme Court?
Right, and so, like you said, this case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and the court heard arguments on April 26th of this year. And on July 1st, the court issued a 6-3 decision that reversed a lower court's ruling, and it struck down this law in question, finding it unconstitutional, that the disclosure requirements violated the First Amendment and that it's too broad in scope. Remember, in the Rhode Island case that we talked about before this, the court found that the law was narrow enough in its scope to not violate free speech rights in the First Amendment. But in this case, the opposite was found.
Yeah, we see this happening with a lot, not just in this policy area, but in a lot of other issues, this constant tug of war between whether or not a law or a ruling is narrowly tailored to achieve a specific end or whether or not it's too broad. And obviously this kind of goes back and forth. So Ethan, given the Supreme Court's decision, how do you think it will influence donor disclosure policy going forward?
Well, it's hard to say. It's not exactly clear how it will affect donor disclosure and privacy laws in other states in the future, but there's some reactions to the case from legal scholars that can give us some idea of some potential future effects that it may have. So, for example, David Strauss, who is a law professor at the University of Chicago, said, quote, "The court has tried to draw a line between disclosures that are really going to hurt people and disclosures that are unlikely to be harmful. The question is whether, after this decision, the court is still going to try to draw that line, or is instead going to say disclosure laws of all kinds risk chilling speech." So the sort of takeaway from this statement is that the decision could open up more opportunities for challenging disclosure laws on the basis of restricting free speech, but it could also have a larger impact on other policy. Rick Hasen, who is a law professor at the University of California in Irvine, said that the Supreme Court's ruling could affect campaign finance laws more broadly. He said, quote, "The court's ruling calls into question a number of campaign finance disclosure laws. Perhaps even more significant, it also threatens the constitutionality of campaign contribution laws, which are judged under the, quote, exacting scrutiny standard. Lower courts can now find that such laws are not narrowly tailored enough to prevent corruption or its appearance, or do not provide voters with valuable information, two interests the court recognized in the past to justify campaign laws," end quote. So what this means is that we could see more state disclosure laws being challenged and more efforts to pass privacy legislation that is focused on protecting donor information. But I mean, as is always the case when trying to predict any future events, we just really don't know. And we'll have to wait and see what exactly happens and what the effects of this case will be.
Yeah, as the past few years have shown us, we really don't know. We think we might have a guess as to how things are going to be affected, but in reality, they tend to be different sometimes. But those are three really interesting developments that you mentioned, Ethan, that could affect what types and the numbers of donor disclosure, either litigation or policy decisions et cetera, that we see going forward. So it sounds like 2020 could be a pretty active year for this, and I'm looking forward to seeing, kind of what sort of effects these different rulings in three different forums may cause. So we also wanted to take a little bit of time with the few minutes that we had left to tackle a few questions that we've received in the course of the folks that have registered for the webinar. So we had one question that basically said, how does Ballotpedia track all of this donor disclosure and privacy legislation?
Well, that's actually, it's actually a really pretty interesting process. So what we basically have is a specific search query that looks through the summary and full text of all current state legislation. And that query finds those that have certain keywords and phrases that are associated with this topic. And now, of course, this doesn't always get you only the bills you want. So part of the process is going through the text of the bills and the summary of the bills to identify if and how they relate to donor disclosure or privacy. And this can really be tricky sometimes because a bill may only have like one provision that affects disclosure, or it may just amend a pre-existing disclosure statute and not be proposing a whole new set of rules itself. But once we identify a bill, it goes in a tracking spreadsheet with all of its relative details, like who sponsored it, what stage of passage it's currently in, and so on. And that's how we're able to identify and keep track of these bills out of the hundreds of bills that go through state legislatures every year.
All right, very interesting. Great insight into how Ballotpedia does what we do. So thanks for that. Another question that we had here is, Ethan, what makes a nonprofit organization subject to these types of disclosure requirements?
Well, I mean, as we talked about at the top of the call, it's only really 501c4 political education organizations that can even engage in political lobbying or issue advocacy. So these rules generally only apply to those sort of organizations that are somehow involved in the political arena. Now, there are federal laws that govern these organizations, but states can enact further requirements, and they don't always take the form of state laws. For instance, the rule in California we discussed earlier was concerned with a specific form of donations, the behested payments. So only nonprofits that would be engaging in those sort of transactions would be subject to that law. So okay. Yeah, it basically depends, but yeah.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. All right, we have time for one more question that we had received earlier, and that is, where can viewers go to learn more about donor disclosure and donor privacy?
Well, Ballotpedia currently has a page on disclosure and privacy policy for every state, where you can look and see what, if any, legislation is being considered that's related to disclosure and privacy. So that'd be a good way to see what's happening in your state. We also have a series of pages that are related to the arguments we discussed earlier, and we plan to have that on site sometime in the near future. And of course, we're going to be sure to check out the monthly issue of the Disclosure Digest, which has all the information on all the bills we're tracking, and it looks into the major developments that have occurred this month, and it has a feature with a lot of details on the most significant one that happened in the previous month.
All right, this has been a fantastic overview of donor disclosure and privacy policy. So Ethan, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. My pleasure. Thank you, Dave. All right, so we had a lot of material to cover. So if we were not able to get to your questions, or if you are, watching this video after it airs live and you have additional questions, feel free to email our editor account, and that's at editor@ballotpedia.org, and we will get you an answer for those questions. I also want to remind you that if you're watching this video, we at Ballotpedia rely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work on this topic or any topic that we cover, and you want to support us, please consider donating by going to www.ballotpedia.org/donate. And there you can see the ways in which you can contribute to make all of our coverage possible. Now, if you've registered for today's briefing, we will be sending you a YouTube link that has a recording of the presentation, and you can use that to share it with friends or colleagues or family members, anybody you know that might be interested more in learning about this, or you can rewatch the webinar, and that link will be coming out to you shortly. And then finally, as Ethan mentioned, if you want to stay informed about the topic of donor disclosure and privacy policy, we do have this regular newsletter called the Disclosure Digest. And the Disclosure Digest discusses laws governing campaign finance, free speech, donor disclosure policy, really this whole area. And Disclosure Digest is just one of our newsletters that we cover a wide variety of topics, anywhere from our daily political summary, the Daily Brew, on to specific things about the federal courts and so forth. So there's a link on our homepage, ballotpedia.org, to our full listing of newsletters, and you can review samples or subscribe to whichever ones that you like. So thank you for joining us on this briefing about donor disclosure and privacy policy. Have a great day, and thank you very much for watching, everyone.